Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're embarking on I think, really crucial deep dive into Kristen R. Godsee's provocative and insightful book, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, and other arguments for economic independence.
Right away, with a title like that, you could feel the conceptual tension. For generations, especially in the Western world, we've been taught to keep these two things completely separate.
Right, the bedroom and the bank.
Exactly, the heart and the ledger. Intimacy, love, sexuality, that's all designated as the private sphere. It's about personal chemistry, individual choice. And then way over on the other side, you have these huge, complex economic systems, like capitalism or state socialism. And those are firmly in the public structural domain.
It's like we're given two totally different maps for life, and the number one rule is that they should never, ever overlap.
That separation is precisely what Ghodsee is challenging here. Her work basically forces those two maps to fold right on top of one another.
Yeah, she just collapses the distinction. So our mission in this deep dive is to really rigorously examine her central argument, which is how fundamentally our economic systems, and specifically the material conditions they create, the design of their social policies, how they shape our personal relationships, how they constrain or expand our choices in those relationships.
And ultimately define things like gender equality and, the actual quality of our private lives.
And it's so vital to get the methodological focus right here. This is not about ideological advocacy for, say, authoritarian regimes. It's not a defense of utopian claims about socialism.
Right. We're not comparing the perfect theory of one system to the messy reality of another.
Exactly. The approach is empirical. It's historical. Ghodsee looks squarely at the actual historical experiences of 20th century state socialism, specifically in the Eastern Bloc.
And she's not doing this to romanticize its political shortcomings, right?
Not at all. The goal is to extract practical, replicable policy lessons that are actually highly relevant to the crises we're facing today, things like gender inequity, precarity, relationship strain.
So the question isn't whether state socialism was politically superior. I think we all know the answer to that is complicated and often very dark.
The question is much more focused. It's what concrete policies did they actually deploy to try and achieve women's economic independence? And what were the measurable results on their personal lives?
Okay, so let's unpack that and start with the author. Who is Kristen R. Ghodsee?
She's an anthropologist and a really leading scholar of Eastern Europe, and her career path is, I think, central to where this book even came from. Her research journey began back in 1997.
So just a few years after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Exactly, a really seismic time. She's there studying the shift from state socialism to market capitalism right as it's happening.
That timing is absolutely crucial. It means she had a front row seat to what she calls the ravages of neoliberal capitalism.
She's observing economies that had been, stable for decades, maybe inefficient, but stable, and they're suddenly being dismantled by this rapid, almost totally unregulated privatization.
And she saw it on the ground. She talks about watching these thriving state-owned factories that employed millions of people, many of them women.
And often provided things we can barely imagine now, like on-site subsidized childcare and housing.
And then almost overnight, they're replaced by these hyper-consumerist Walmart-style megastores. And this transition, of course, resulted in massive unemployment and just the complete erosion of social safety nets.
And that's where you see the human cost. This rapid shift, which was often mandated by Western economic institutions, it pushed many women back into a state of economic subordination.
Because with the state jobs gone and the socialized care vanishing,
they were forced back into depending on individual men for their security and their resources. And seeing this firsthand, this escalating female precarity in the new capitalist East, that became the intellectual spark for the whole book. She wanted to know what had been lost in that transition.
Before we go deeper, we should probably clarify some terms, because Ghodsee is very precise about this. She draws a really sharp line between state socialism.
Right, which refers to the regimes of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, single communist parties, curtailed political freedoms, the systems that were, the subject of intense Cold War propaganda.
And on the other hand, democratic socialism.
Which she uses to refer to systems more like what you find in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark. Countries where you have core socialist principles, universal health care, generous safety nets, significant regulation.
But coexisting with free and fair elections, robust political rights, and, elements of a competitive market.
Absolutely. So Ghodsee is primarily using the policy toolkit of the former state socialism to inform potential improvements in the modern democracies of the latter.
And the reason she wrote this book, she explains, was to push back against that wave of Western triumphalism that swept the globe after 1989.
That whole end of history idea.
Exactly. This idea that political freedom was one and the same as unfettered free markets. So she chose the subject of sexuality, which seems so private, almost trivial, specifically to expose the shortcomings of unfettered free markets right where they hurt people most.
In their intimate lives, in their search for happiness.
And the deep philosophical context here, goes back to that famous rallying cry from second-wave feminism.
The political is personal.
Right. Ghodsee's argument is that the transactional nature of capitalism doesn't just stay in the workplace. It actively infiltrates our lives. It commodifies sexuality. It preys on our relationship insecurities.
It encourages us to see everything, our emotions, our attention, our bodies, our affection, as resources to be, quantified, marketed, and sold. It reduces our human worth to exchange value.
Which brings us to the central thesis of the book, stated as clearly as possible.
Unregulated capitalism is, she argues, structurally bad for women. But by adopting certain key socialist policies, specifically policies that guarantee economic independence, support better labor conditions, and create a strong work-family balance,
you end up with more honest relationships, greater autonomy, and yes, statistically, better sex.
And this is achieved by using a generous institutional safety net to, fundamentally decouple love and intimacy from raw economic considerations.
It's an argument built on material reality, not just ideals.
Exactly. If a woman doesn't need a partner for financial survival, if she has her own guaranteed income, her own healthcare, her own retirement security, then her choice of partner is based on attraction, affection, compatibility.
Not necessity.
Not necessity. And that shift in the power dynamic is where genuine relational equality actually begins.
So let's dig into that. Let's move into the structural problems the book identifies in unfettered capitalism. It starts with how the system generates and reinforces female economic dependence.
Yeah, and it does this often despite the existence of anti-discrimination laws. Ghodsee argues that competitive labor markets are just inherently discriminatory against women.
Because of biology.
Because of reproductive biology, and just as importantly, the deeply ingrained societal expectation that women will be the primary caregivers.
This isn't a new problem, is it? It feels like it's sort of baked into the industrial model itself.
It is. Historically, going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, women were valued in the workforce not as equals, but because they offered a comparative advantage.
They would do the same work for less money.
Like men, but cheaper. And this institutional discrimination was actually formalized in Western law and culture for centuries.
We have to remember these historical legal concepts, like coverture.
Oh, absolutely. The legal doctrine where a married woman's entire legal identity was just subsumed by her husband's, she literally became his property.
No legal right to own property, enter contracts, or even control her own wages.
And while the law of coverture is gone, Ghodsee argues that the institutional mindset it represents, it just lingers in the labor market.
And that mindset persisted well into the 20th century through another concept, the family wage.
Right. This was the societal assumption, and it was often codified in union negotiations and wage policies, that men were entitled to a wage large enough to support an entire family.
Which meant that women's wages were considered just supplementary, pocket money.
Exactly. Regardless of whether they were single or divorced or the primary breadwinner for their family, this kind of structural discrimination ensures that, on average, women are just comparatively worse off in countries with less regulation and fewer protections.
But the real profit engine for capitalism, as the book explains it, relies on a mechanism that is completely invisible on any corporate balance sheet.
Women's unpaid domestic labor.
Yes. Capitalism thrives on women's free care work, childcare, elderly care, cooking, emotional labor, household management, because this labor, which literally reproduces the future workforce, is externalized from the market.
I mean, think about the pure economics of it. If the state or corporations actually had to pay fair market value for every hour of childcare, cleaning, and emotional support required to keep a productive worker employed,
corporate taxes would have to skyrocket. Profits would plummet.
So by relying on the traditional nuclear family structure and this gendered division of labor, capitalism effectively shifts the entire cost of reproducing the labor force onto families, with women doing the vast majority of that unseen, uncompensated work.
And this mechanism leads directly to this trap of dependence. Ghodsee illustrates this so powerfully with an anecdote about her friend Lisa.
Right. Lisa was a well-educated professional, but she chose to be a stay-at-home mother, and she was supported entirely by her high-earning husband, Bill.
And Ghodsee notes that at first, Lisa really defended this choice. She saw it as a matter of personal freedom, a break from the corporate rat race.
But the material reality was that Lisa became structurally vulnerable. She had no independent economic claim over the household resources, none. It all depended on Bill's goodwill.
She wasn't contributing anything to her own Social Security or retirement fund. Her access to basic medical care was completely tied to Bill's job. And if the marriage ended,
she'd face a massive economic cliff, just total discontinuity.
And the moment of truth in the story comes during an argument Ghodsee overhears. Bill denies Lisa access to their joint credit card for basic household things.
He accuses her of overspending on herself. The psychological control that his economic leverage gave him was just total.
Lisa's incredibly valuable labor managing the home, raising 3 children. It was rendered invisible and worthless by the market, and that left her financially trapped, totally dependent on the emotional whims of her partner.
This is exactly what George Bernard Shaw was getting at back in 1928. He wrote that capitalism acts on women as a continual bribe to enter into sex relations for money, whether in or out of marriage.
It creates a constant economic necessity, and that forces women across all class lines to think about the financial implications of the relationship choices.
And this necessity is what causes financial precarity to fundamentally distort intimacy. It turns relationships transactional.
Which brings us to a pretty controversial area the book touches on, sexual economics theory.
Right. Which proposes that courtship, at its core, can be looked at as a kind of market exchange. In this model, sex is the commodity that is primarily controlled by women.
Which men then purchase using non-sexual resources.
Exactly. Things like commitment, protection, stability, material favors, or just outright money. The theory posits that the romance and love we perceive are often just cognitive veils.
Veils designed by evolution and culture to hide the harsh transactional nature of the exchange.
The theory also has this idea called the price of sex. When women lack economic opportunities or access to reliable birth control, the risk of pregnancy is high, so men have to offer a higher price for sex.
Which usually means marriage, commitment, economic security.
Right. But conversely, when women's economic opportunities increase or birth control becomes ubiquitous, the price of sex supposedly falls because women can afford to accept a less robust commitment.
And Ghodsee connects this theory to this genuinely heartbreaking story about her college friend, Ken.
A highly successful capitalist who tragically perished on 9/11, Ken fell deeply, genuinely in love with a woman and married her, and he believed the affection was completely reciprocal.
But it wasn't.
It was only later, after he noticed some suspicious financial activities, that he realized the marriage may have been a cold, calculated economic transaction, in exchange for a green card, U.S. citizenship, and a new life in America.
What's so fascinating there is that his economic power didn't protect him. It actually blinded him.
Exactly. His wealth masked the transactional reality of the relationship, and that left him vulnerable to this profound emotional deceit. He couldn't tell the difference between a real connection and a very sophisticated economic exchange.
And the lesson there is just devastating for both sides. When money becomes the foundation of affection, honesty is the first casualty.
The dependent partner loses their autonomy, and the powerful partner loses the ability to ever trust if the relationship is genuine. Both are fundamentally alienated from authentic intimacy.
The problem of dependence is so stark. So the real question becomes, what specific policies did those 20th century state socialist regimes actually implement to try and break that cycle?
This is the state socialist policy toolkit, and the first major contrast with the West is this mandate of full workforce participation.
Right. Unlike in the West, where women's entry into the workforce was often this slow, market-driven process.
State socialist regimes explicitly prioritized women's emancipation through their full mandatory incorporation into the labor force. The idea was that economic independence was the absolute necessary precursor to political and personal independence.
And the numbers really bore this out.
Yeah.
It's consistently noted that nowhere in the world were there higher rates of female workforce participation than under state socialism.
The philosophical roots go way back to figures like Inessa Armand, a key Bolshevik leader who declared back in 1920, if women's liberation is unthinkable without communism, then communism is unthinkable without women's liberation.
And this wasn't just rhetoric, was it?
Not at all. Vast state resources were poured into women's education, training, literacy programs, specifically to prepare them for professional roles, even in sectors traditionally reserved for men, like heavy industry, mining, engineering. The state needed the labor, yes, but they framed it as liberation through work.
But they also recognized that mandatory employment would create a crippling double burden.
A huge double burden, the work outside the home and the work inside the home. So, to counter that, state socialist governments instituted these comprehensive, massive programs aimed at socializing care and reproduction.
This institutionalization of care was designed to be the counterweight. They invested heavily in these extensive networks of public creches for infants, kindergartens for toddlers,
Factory canteens, community laundry services, public cafeterias, all of it designed to reduce the time, the cost, and the physical strain of domestic labor, which had always been borne by women.
The scale of this is really hard to comprehend from a modern capitalist perspective.
It is. In East Germany, for example, by the 1980s, virtually every child had access to subsidized, high-quality public childcare from infancy onward.
This wasn't some patchwork of expensive private options.
No, it was a fundamental public utility. It ensured that a woman could go to work knowing her child was secure and well cared for, often right at her workplace or close by.
And then you have formalized paid leave.
Yeah.
This actually predates state socialism, but they implemented it so aggressively.
The concept was championed by democratic socialists like Lily Braun as early as 1897. She proposed a state-funded maternity insurance.
And her argument was powerful and simple.
So simple. Since society benefits from children, they grow up to be workers, soldiers, taxpayers. Society, not the individual woman, should bear the costs of raising them. And you fund it through a progressive income tax on everyone.
And the state socialist countries ran with this idea. By 1956, Czechoslovakia guaranteed a remarkable 18 weeks of fully paid, job-protected leave.
And Bulgaria went even further. They offered 120 days of fully paid leave with extended partially paid leave that could last up to 3 years, all while your job was protected.
And you contrast that with the United States. We didn't even pass a federal law ensuring unpaid job-protected leave until 1993.
And even today, the U.S. stands virtually alone among developed nations in lacking any kind of mandated, federally funded, paid maternity leave. The difference in institutional priority is just staggering.
Another crucial policy lever Ghodsee points to is the public sector advantage. The idea of expanding government employment to act as a deliberate counterweight to the biases you see in private markets.
We see this playing out right now in the democratic socialist models of Northern Europe. In Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, women account for nearly 70% of all public employees.
And that sector is characterized by more unionization, standardized pay scales, flexible conditions.
And, critically, a much smaller gender wage gap compared to the private sector. The state sets a standard for fair labor practices.
And the reverse is so painfully visible in the U.S. After the Great Recession, the sharp decline in public sector jobs, as states and cities cut their budgets, it disproportionately harmed African American women.
Absolutely. They had found secure middle-class careers in public service, and then were often forced into more precarious, lower-paying private jobs where both gender and racial biases were far more pronounced.
This connects directly to the idea of job security and guarantees. This was foundational under state socialism, but it's now resurfacing in modern policy debates.
Like the UK Labour Party proposals, or the Center for American Progress's Marshall Plan for America. These all argue for the state to act as the employer of last resort, guaranteeing a living wage and benefits.
And a job guarantee benefits women, specifically because by setting a high, non-discriminatory wage floor for millions of government jobs, it puts upward pressure on private sector wages.
And it helps eliminate those systemic wage gaps that are often so hard to fight in a competitive market.
Ghodsee even grounds the philosophical justification for this in, of all places, a spiritual tradition. She uses the parable of the workers in the vineyard.
From the Gospel of Matthew, yeah. In the story, the landowner pays all the workers the same wage no matter how many hours they work that day.
And the traditional socialist reading of that is that the principle of dignity and necessity, the fact that every worker needed the pay to live, it trumps the market calculation of hourly output.
It prioritizes human need over capitalist efficiency, a really powerful idea.
So now we take all those policies and we map them back onto intimate life. The most profound consequence of making both men and women equally reliant on the state,
rather than dependent on each other,
was the systemic decoupling of personal relationships from market influences.
The mechanism of independence is just so straightforward here. Women didn't have to marry for money. If a woman had her own secure job, her own pension, her own subsidized housing, and access to universal health care and childcare guaranteed by the state.
The financial incentive to tolerate an unfulfilling, unequal, or even abusive relationship just evaporates.
And that freedom led directly to greater relational equality and, she argues, greater satisfaction.
The East German government, the GDR, took this idea a step further. They actively tried to prove the superiority of their system in the bedroom.
They did. They explicitly argued that because sex wasn't a commodity in their system, it was inherently better and more fulfilling.
This led to some fascinating research.
Fascinating, if politically motivated research. Like the 1984 study by Stark and Friedrich on young East German women. The study reported that 2/3 of the women surveyed claimed to achieve orgasm almost always.
And the researchers didn't attribute this to, say, better sex education or technique.
No, they deliberately attributed it to the socialist life itself, to the sense of profound social security, the guaranteed equality in education and work, the institutional support for work-life balance.
That study sounds remarkable, but you have to ask, given the political context of the GDR, a surveillance state that was intensely motivated to prove its superiority over the capitalist West, how reliable were statistics like that?
That's a really necessary point of critical engagement. There is certainly reason to be skeptical of data that's produced by a state with such an explicit agenda.
Could the motivation to prove superiority have colored the research, maybe leading to some self-censoring in the responses?
I think that's very likely. But even if the absolute number is inflated, the persistence of the claim is still significant. It reflects the genuine cultural shift they were trying to achieve.
Which was what?
Legitimizing female pleasure and linking it directly to economic equality. The Czechoslovak sexologists, for instance, they openly criticized capitalism for forcing women into these unhappy transactional marriages. They argued that good sex was only possible when men and women could meet as social and economic equals.
We get a much clearer picture of this mechanism by looking at the reverse, don't we? The immediate and, frankly, devastating effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
The case study of Russian women's sexual scripts after 1991 really does act as a grim, natural experiment that supports Ghodsee's thesis.
So during the relatively stable Soviet era, say from 1945 to 1965, sociological studies noted that urban middle-class women were adopting two main scripts.
The romantic script, where sex was integral to emotional love and deep connection, and the friendship script, where sex was an expression of affection between two economically secure, equal partners.
But then after 1991, with hyper-commercialization, massive privatization, soaring inequality, those scripts were radically supplanted.
They were. Sociologists documented the ubiquitous emergence of the instrumental script. In this new, harsher reality, sexuality and marriage were openly viewed as resources to be profitably exchanged for material benefits. Marriage became an explicit calculation of financial gain and loss.
And this return to commodification is illustrated most vividly by that exposé on Moscow's gold digger academies.
It's just unbelievable. These weren't some underground operations. These were expensive, specialized finishing schools where young women paid a lot of money for training, basically market research, on how to efficiently identify and marry extremely wealthy men.
Who they openly called Forbeses.
After the magazine's rich list, yes, the mindset was clear. Pursuing a high-stakes, high-reward marriage was seen as a better, faster, and more rational investment of time and resources than dedicating a decade to an uncertain career in the new, chaotic market economy.
The language itself reflected this harsh buyer's market. Rich men were Forbeses, and young women were sometimes derogatorily called tiolki,
which means cattle. This swift, institutionalized commodification showed exactly what happens when the state withdraws that layer of security.
It's crucial, though, to also acknowledge the limits of the state's socialist policies. They achieved a lot in terms of economic autonomy, but they really struggled with cultural inertia.
The double burden often persisted, even with mandatory employment and subsidized care.
They tried to enforce cultural change, though. We see examples like a Bulgarian Politburo decision and countless articles in state-run women's magazines explicitly mandating that men share domestic duties and be more active fathers.
But the results were very mixed.
Why did the double burden persist then?
Largely because of these deeply ingrained cultural expectations about male and female roles that policy alone couldn't just overturn. Men were socialized to see women's entry into the labor force as an economic contribution to the state.
But not necessarily a mandate for them to change their own behavior at home.
Right. And sometimes the state's economic production goals were prioritized over the social goal of eliminating that domestic inequality. It just shows that institutional change is necessary, but it's not sufficient without a simultaneous, profound cultural transformation.
So let's connect these historical lessons to the precarious present day in advanced capitalist societies. The lack of institutional support today, especially the failure to socialize care, it makes motherhood financially crushing.
Even for highly educated professionals.
Ghodsee captures this modern structural absurdity with the story of her colleague Leslie.
Right. Leslie was a professional woman with 3 young children. To manage the load, she reduced her schedule to three-quarters time, and the financial calculation was just staggering.
After mandatory payroll deductions for taxes and the astronomically high cost of private childcare for 3 kids, Leslie worked 30 hours a week for a net monthly take-home pay of
70 cents.
70 cents.
Yeah.
That's not a meaningful financial contribution. That is, as you said, a structural absurdity.
And she did this for 3 solid years. Not for the money, obviously, but explicitly to maintain her professional identity and not fall into that trap of complete economic dependence, like her friend Lisa.
She was paying an effective tax on her own identity and autonomy.
And this modern economic insecurity, it is wreaking havoc on our collective mental health and our relationship stability. The late theorist Mark Fisher argued so compellingly that rising anxiety, depression, and psychological distress are negative externalities. They're unpaid costs of a capitalist system.
A system that relentlessly reduces human worth to its exchange value and demands perpetual performance in a precarious economy.
We're all perpetually exhausted and financially stressed, and that leaves very little emotional energy for the genuine, sustained intimacy that relationships require.
And that exhaustion and precarity pushes people into transactions they might otherwise avoid. We're now seeing college-educated young women turning to websites like seekingarrangement.com.
Actively seeking sugar daddies, and not for luxury items, but to pay for basic necessities, groceries, tuition, textbooks.
This isn't some phenomenon on the margins anymore, is it? It's becoming mainstream among students who are facing crippling debt and rising living costs.
The lack of adequate social safety nets, student aid, subsidized housing, viable minimum wage jobs, it coerces commodified sexuality. Not because these women lack morals, but because they lack structural financial alternatives. It is a coerced exchange born of material necessity.
And this precarity is what's fueling the political shifts we're seeing. The perceived failure of capitalism after 2008, combined with inherited inequality and crushing debt, it's made socialist ideas highly appealing to younger generations.
The polling data is compelling. A 2017 survey showed that among millennials, more people preferred to live in a socialist country, that was 44%, than a capitalist one, which was 42%.
And there's a distinct gender gap in those opinions.
A huge one. Men surveyed had a 12 percentage point greater favorable view of capitalism than women did. It was 56% versus 44%.
Which strongly indicates that women voters who experience the discrimination and the wage gaps of the free market so acutely are much more inclined toward redistributive and supportive policies.
They're voting their economic interests. They're seeking institutional support to mitigate the risks that the market disproportionately assigns to them.
And this political reality has not gone unnoticed by the opposition. Ghodsee talks about the explicit right-wing backlash and the fear among conservatives of women voting their collective economic interests into law.
This fear is evidenced by these fringe but persistent movements like Repeal the 19th, where men's rights activists rely on studies like a 1999 paper by Lott and Kenny to argue that women's suffrage was historically responsible for the growth of government spending.
The logic being that once women gained the vote,
Right.
they consistently supported more social services, childcare, welfare programs, because they recognized the need for institutional support.
Which is, ironically, a pretty accurate, if paranoid, acknowledgement of women's political power to push for redistribution.
And this fear gets cemented when conservative media frames policies like universal childcare as an evil plot.
They argue it's a form of totalitarian indoctrination, designed to undermine male authority and dismantle the traditional hierarchical family structure, a structure that relies on female economic dependence. They correctly identify communal support as a direct threat to patriarchy.
So our analysis brings us back full circle to these broader systems themes that Ghodsee explores. The primary takeaway seems to be that economic systems are anything but neutral.
They are highly active architects of our private lives, and they relentlessly impose a transactional ethos onto our most intimate relationships.
It goes back to the foundational critiques of capitalism. Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto that capitalism has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment.
It systematically tears away the sentimental veil from the family, reducing it to a mere money relation, where everything, including love and loyalty, has to be quantified and exchanged.
And this transactional view really limits what we typically define as true freedom. We praise choice and liberty, but those terms become pretty hollow when your survival, your security, your well-being are all inextricably tied to a single partner or a specific hated job.
Albert Einstein, in his 1949 essay, Why Socialism, he described this crippling of individuals as the worst evil of capitalism. He argued that economic anarchy, the relentless competition and insecurity of the free market, fundamentally undermines basic human freedoms, especially the freedom to relate authentically.
And there is no starker real-world example of this structural crippling than the American healthcare system.
No, there isn't. Millions of Americans, especially women who may have lower earning capacity or took career breaks, are trapped. They're trapped in jobs they hate or in unsatisfying, unequal marriages because losing their job or getting a divorce means losing access to affordable, life-saving medical care.
The freedom to leave, the freedom to choose, it's economically foreclosed by institutional design.
Therefore, Ghodsee argues true personal autonomy, the freedom to choose a partner based on love, not necessity, requires institutional support. She points to the generous social safety nets of democratic socialist countries in Northern Europe as the operational model.
A model for granting citizens the ability to make basic life decisions without economic coercion.
These policies act as a kind of structural divorce fund, a career change cushion, a security guarantee regardless of your marital status.
The Icelandic example is just the perfect synthesis of this, isn't it? Showing how institutional support can work for both sexes.
It is. In Iceland, fathers are mandated 90 days of paid, non-transferable leave. And critically, 90% of them actually take it.
Which demonstrates how the state can proactively intervene to support a healthy work-family balance for both parents. It fosters greater gender equality, not just in the workplace.
But crucially, in the division of domestic and childcare labor at home, it's an institutional framework for authentic, shared parenting.
So, to synthesize the core insight of Ghodsee's work, when institutions take responsibility for women's basic economic stability,
Through things like guaranteed job security, universal health care, socialized care,
love and intimacy are less likely to be corrupted by transactional necessity. This leads to more authentic, honest, emotionally satisfying, and relationally equal partnerships.
the path to greater autonomy, then, is institutional. It's pragmatic. We're talking about concrete, non-authoritarian steps.
Universal health care, highly subsidized, high-quality childcare, and robust shared paid parental leave. These aren't utopian fantasies. They're operational and proven in democratic societies all over the world.
But the book also forces us to address the ongoing challenges. How do we form powerful, persistent citizen coalitions that are capable of combating the forces of plutocracy, the wealthy interests that continuously try to dismantle these very safety nets to keep their own tax burdens low?
And how do we overcome the intense political baggage and fear that stems from 20th century authoritarianism to adopt these communalist policies that are demonstrably beneficial to our quality of life and relational stability?
We have to find a way to talk about structural support without triggering the historical specter of the Gulag.
Ultimately, this seems to boil down to reclaiming our personal sovereignty, our mental well-being from the market.
We need to establish what Ghodsee calls affective sovereignty, the control of our own emotional labor, our attention, our affections. We have to consciously push back against the dominant ideology that wants to reduce every social bond we have into a node of economic exchange.
And we can end with that reflective motto Ghodsee saw on a Munich bookstore awning, which just beautifully captures the counterintuitive power of this whole argument.
Love kills capitalism.
Right. If people are truly happy and secure in their intimate lives, feeling loved and supported for who they are, the system loses its ability to convince them to buy more, work more, and consume more to fill the void left by their lack of authentic personal connection.
By refusing to let our affections become commodities, we initiate a powerful form of economic and personal resistance. We credit Kristen R. Ghodsee for the book Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, and other arguments for economic independence.
We highly encourage you to read the book, support the author, or borrow it from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.